Gender-based violence perpetuated in our communities takes on a very unique and distinct crime and abhorrent human right violation that challenges the core of us as human beings, declared to have dignity, worth and value, not only from a theological standpoint but also as codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is something I'm very passionate about, and I'd just like to take you through a presentation in relation to the Nordic model to show you a little bit about its approach and what it does. So this legislative policy approach that originated in Sweden in 1999 basically criminalises the demand for commodification of flesh. It provides exit programs to those who wish to leave and protects vulnerable women. So the Nordic model laws on prostitution were initially implemented in Sweden in 1999, where the government declared that Sweden's official attitude to prostitution had been that it is an unacceptable phenomenon in the society and must be combated. And this was because they recognised and understood the gender-based violent nature of an industry that perpetuates this crime. So Nordic model law decriminalises all people who sell sex and provides exit programs for those who wish to leave the sex trade. Prostitution law is part of broader legislation in Sweden known as Women's Peace and Sanctuary Laws. This is really important because it's not a standalone law. It actually is a robust, holistic approach to protecting women's rights. So Chapter 6, Section 8 of the Swedish Penal Code is key, and it states that anyone who promotes or encourages or improperly exploits for commercial purposes casual sexual relations entered into by another person in exchange for payment is guilty of a criminal offence. So for the first 10 years, this was enforced mainly through fines, but Sweden did move towards a penal offence provisions. So the sentencing not only took the form of first warning being a fine, but if for repeat offenders, it did was sentencing for imprisonment up to 3 to 6 months. So the three main areas of prosecution of the user of sexual services under the Swedish law is number 1, the purchase of the sexual service, number 2, the procurement of the sexual service, and number 3, the legalized form of human trafficking. So Sweden did this in order to damage the market of trafficking driven by brothel owners, and this link is clearly identified in international studies to date. So 10 years after the implementation of the law in Sweden, there was a review of the law, and the evaluation showed that the prohibition of the purchase of sexual services had the intended effect, and it's an important instrument in preventing and combating prostitution and human trafficking for sexual purposes. So if we take the Swedish law and hold it alongside the international law against human trafficking, the Trafficking Protocol, we can see that one of the supplementary protocols to the United Nations Convention defining trafficking as containing an act, improper means and a purpose of exploitation, the Swedish law is compatible with this international standard. So this is the law, human trafficking, international law broken down into the act, mean and the purpose. And of course, if a child is trafficked, purpose is not required to be proven. So you think that slavery was abolished? Guess again. There are more slaves in the world today than there have ever been before, and slaves today do not look like this. There are several reasons why there are slaves in the world today, and we refer to these as push and pull factors. So poverty is often cited as the main push and pull factor, but I would like to submit to you today that the underlying reason is actually gender-based violence, the exception of these crimes, particularly sexual violence against women. So there's several forms of human trafficking, and obviously sexual exploitation is just one of them, but it's the most heinous in relation to the violation it causes a woman's body, the trauma that it causes, and the requirement for lifelong rehabilitation in relation to this crime. So these are some of the images that capture trafficking, and of course agriculture does encourage labour, slavery, as do what's referred to as sweatshops. There are domestic slaves, there are forced marriage and child marriage situations that are come under the banner of trafficking. But again, the gravest form is sexual servitude, whereby the person's body is no longer theirs and they are violated again and again, traumatized and humiliated. So when we look at the statistics, there are approximately 35.8 million known slaves in the world today. 1% of those are ever rescued. The average price of a slave is $90. It's a $150 billion industry. Every 30 seconds, someone becomes a victim of human trafficking. And it's the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world because it is unfortunately profitable. The profits made from trafficking are mostly sexual exploitation, as you can see there, 66%. So who are the victims of trafficking? Unfortunately, 80% of victims are female, which includes 50% of victims of trafficking being under the age of 16. Sexual exploitation makes up 79% of identified forms of human trafficking. And this was identified in Sweden way back when in 1999. In Sweden, they understand that any society that claims to defend principles of legal, political, economic and social equality for women and girls must reject the idea that a woman and child, mostly girls, are commodities that can be bought and sold and sexually exploited by men. So the Nordic model laws on prostitution were initially implemented under a raft of policy initiatives under the Women's Peace and Sanctuary Bill. So this shifted their understanding of prostitution leading to gender-based sexual violent crimes, not only in the industry itself, but in the community. So Nordic model laws decriminalise all people who sell sex and provide exit programs for those who wish to leave the same trade. The prostitution laws are part of broader legislation that protect women, and as a result of criminalising buyers, the laws have had marked effect on cultural attitudes towards women in particular. So international studies and experts in the field, such as psychologists, Melissa Farley in particular, do link prostitution to gender inequality directly. Prostitution and human trafficking for sexual purposes represents a serious obstacle to both social equality and gender equality. Prostitution is a form of gender inequality. For example, the mortality rate of women in prostitution is 200 times higher than the general population. Murder accounts for 50% of the deaths of women in prostitution. 89% of 854 prostituted women interviewed wanted to escape prostitution, but felt like they couldn't. And there's overwhelming evidence that prostitution is inherently harmful, dehumanizing, and it fuels sex trafficking in particular. So now we come to this concept of voluntariness And when we look at voluntariness, we need to take into account a person's situation as they entered the industry. When we look at the statistics, international studies, we understand that many prostitutes are from vulnerable people groups. For example, they've experienced childhood sexual abuse, 80%, 50% are homeless, and 60% are from low socioeconomic backgrounds with lack of access to education and employment opportunities. So when we take these factors into account, it's hardly a voluntary decision that they've made. Another reality of the prostitution industry is a post-traumatic stress disorder amongst women in prostitution is extremely high, 68%. And it's comparable to the trauma faced by rape survivors and survivors of state-sponsored torture. Let's bring it more locally. Prostitute women working in Sydney, study shows that more than half left home before the age of 16. They have a literacy rate of a Year 9 student. 14% of those entering prostitution had no fixed address, were currently homeless. 50% reported being homeless within the past 12 months. 3/4 experienced childhood sexual abuse. A third reported moving into prostitution before the age of 18. And 85% reported experiencing violence in prostitution. So a lot of persons in the industry, unfortunately, not only cope with post-traumatic stress, but other mental illnesses that are not addressed, and they do try and attempt suicide, and they have to deal with STDs and all sorts of sexually transmitted viruses. So as a society, we have moved towards understanding prostitution as sex work and a legitimate industry. But when we look at the vulnerability of the cohort working in the industry, the gender-based violence, crime, and sexual abuse assault that's perpetuated in the industry, it's hardly a workplace environment, is it? Would you accept going to work and being raped against your will every day and go back to that same workplace? Would you accept beatings and bashings and trauma abuse and post-traumatic stress experiences in your workplace and accept that? No. So why do we accept it in this industry? Something needs to be done. We need to wake up and understand that women in prostitution are often vulnerable to begin with. They do not choose voluntarily to enter the industry. And secondly, it perpetuates not only gender-based sexual violence, it also perpetuates international crime. Australian Institute of Criminology has linked many brothels to money laundering, drug trafficking, and of course bikie gangs. So we have to do something for these vulnerable women that are suffering. There are several findings in international studies that indicate that men who buy sex share certain characteristics with men who are at risk of committing sexual aggression. So the industry not only harms women, but the industry actually harms men. Those who buy sex on average have less empathy for women in prostitution and view them as intrinsically different from other women. This is incompatible and inconsistent with Universal Declaration of Human Rights, stating that all persons are and have dignity. This UN study shows transactional sex as an important factor in the lives of rapists. This is extremely concerning. So as a society, we're making an unequivocal statement to the poor, exploited women and girls when we, the citizens of wealthy countries, tell them that it's not okay to buy human beings for sexual purposes. So let's look at the gender-based violence perpetuated in our communities. This is Australia-based study. 44.8% or close have to half of all Australians have experienced violence since the age of 15. 1 in 5 Australian women have experienced sexual violence. So we know that family violence is a national problem, including domestic violence. And this industry is bound to perpetuate these things. Violence against women is rife internationally, and the international statistics are 1 in 3 women throughout the world will experience physical and or sexual violence. Now, this image is extremely important. We need to understand that commodifying flesh actually makes them a slave. If we're selling bodies, we're selling slaves. We have to stop this. Another nature of the industry itself is it's extremely racist. So, for example, if I were to be sold on the market, I'm from Romania, you get about $3,000 to $6,000 for me. It's just despicable. There are links between the viewing of harmful online material and trafficking itself. And of course, links between trafficking, gender-based violence, and prostitution. So even though we've got international laws condemning violence against women and defining forced prostitution and sex slavery as violence against women, 1 in 3 women still experience physical or sexual violence. As long as women are for sale, no woman will be viewed as equal in corporate boardrooms, in the halls of legislature, or in the homes. Violence against women begins with disrespecting women. Demand needs to be addressed. So this is my message today to you. Demand leads to demand. And demand of not only commodification of flesh, but the purchase of sex needs to be addressed in our societies that perpetuates these crimes and abhorrent human rights violations of vulnerable persons. This is a perfect example of where the industry leads. This Australian sex tourist in the Philippines was caught recently as a child sex predator who had not only tortured physically and sexually his victims, but murdered them and buried them under his house in the Philippines. Children, babies as young as 5 months, and selling the footage online. Absolutely abhorrent. We had the recent case of this man, Michael Quinn, who was a footy player from Melbourne, trying to procure sex from a 6-year-old boy as he's travelling to the US. These forms of abhorrent crimes and human rights violations against children are perpetuated, first of all, online, secondly, by societal standards, and thirdly, by the propping up of an industry that actually facilitates these crimes. It goes on. Ben McCormick was the most recent example. So let's break the myth of legalization. International studies are showing that when prostitution is legalized, it actually perpetuates not only gender-based sexual violent crimes, not only international crimes such as money laundering, drug trafficking, but also human trafficking and slavery. We have to wake up and understand these links. We have to understand that internationally, governments are waking up to this. They're realizing that legalization and decriminalization of prostitution is not working. And they're looking to the Nordic model as a solution, as a way forward. So, legislatively, we need to consider the Nordic model. In relation to the policy approach, we need to consider exit programs and rehabilitation for the victims. The European Women's Lobby recently reported that 80% of registered victims of trafficking are women and girls, and 69% are trafficked into the sex industry. So this is alarming across Europe, and the EU is considering the Nordic model currently. So we need to understand that our legalized industry of prostitution actually creates a demand for trafficked persons. It's an economic equation. There is a demand and the supply will come. So a way around this is to attack transnational trafficking and the crime, but locally we need to begin first by addressing our prostitution laws and addressing the gender-based violent attitudinal behaviours in our communities. So let's look at the sex trade in general. Again, this is an example in the sex trade of racism, of beatings, bashings, and extreme violence, as well as pedophilic tendencies. So the women, as we know, in prostitution are extremely vulnerable. Here are some statistics. Majority are abused as children. Majority started before they were 18 and majority were homeless. In contrast, the purchasers of these sexual services engage in gender-based violent behaviours, including rape and physical violence. This is a Melissa Farley international study. She shows that 89% of those in brothels want to get out but feel they have no way of doing that. This is a victim survivor's story of the trauma she encountered, and this is an advocate making the link between prostituted women and the harmful online material. So the industry itself is not profitable for the girls who work in it. It's only profitable for the brothel owners, the managers, and the traffickers. We need to understand that women are not earning money in the industry. They're being abused, traumatized, and they are not gaining anything for it. So we need to understand, just like we did with smoking and asbestos, there are physical, mental, societal harms to this legalized industry. Let's look at the profiles of those who purchase sex. Buyers are more likely to commit rape and sexual violence than non-buyers. 1 in every 6 Aussie men have paid for sex. This is Professor Michael Flood's study here in Australia. He cites that average blokes from all walks of life buy sex, and most have wives. So there goes the myth of, those requiring it. And to be honest, men aren't actually proud or pleased with their behaviour at the end of it. So we need to look at the industry very closely and ask ourselves, what's the difference between a slave market with a woman holding up a price and the reception of a brothel? The commodification of flesh needs to be questioned in our society, and the links between that and extreme harms needs to be addressed. We know that Australia is a destination country for trafficked women and girls, and we know that there is a rise in trafficking, particularly of Asian women coming in on student visas and as tourists. We know that criminalising brothels does not drive it underground. In fact, criminalising prostitution is not the way to go. But either is legalisation or decriminalisation. We need a fourth alternative. We need to consider the Nordic model. Human traffickers do target tourist hotspots. We know that most recently from the Commonwealth Games in Brisbane, many women were trafficked into Brizzy for the games and the demand there. So the laws include under the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, the Trafficking Protocol. We have the Trafficking Protocol under the UNODC that drives the international initiatives. We have several UN campaigns, World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, 30th of June, and many other initiatives. The GLOAC, Global Action Against Trafficking in Persons and Smuggling of Migrants. We know that migrants, refugees and displaced persons are extremely vulnerable to traffickers. And we know that under the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 8.7, clearly states that there's an international move towards eradicating slavery and trafficking. But this cannot be done unless we address the legalization and decriminalization of prostitution itself. So, under the SDGs, number 5, goal 5, gender equality. Number 8, decent work and economic growth. Number 10, reduce inequalities. Number 16, peace, justice and strong institution. And number 17, partnerships for the goals, is extremely relevant to our conversation. We need to achieve gender equality as a coalition of supporters. And we need to be compatible with international standards such as Article 1 of the Declaration of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, where it states physical, sexual, psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private, is violence against women and an act of gender-based violence. Article 2 further defines gender-based physical violence as physical, sexual and psychological violence occurring within general community, including rape, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, intimidation at work, and trafficking in women and forced prostitution. The laws are clear and we need to start being compatible with them. Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. No one shall be subject to torture or cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment or punishment, and no one shall be required to perform forced or compulsory labour. The ICCPR of Articles 7 and 8. Forced prostitution falls clearly into these categories. The UN has time and time again condemned trafficking in persons, and we need to understand that legalization of an industry that perpetuates these crimes are incompatible. We've seen an international success of the Nordic model, including in relation to the 10-year report coming out of Sweden. The success of these laws are clear. Reports from governments themselves, reports from survivors, and reports from not-for-profit organisations that work with the victims. There is value and necessity of continued and sustained social work to prevent and combat prostitution and human trafficking for sexual purposes, and proposed the establishment of a national centre tasked with coordinating efforts against prostitution and human trafficking for sexual purposes, was one of the inquiry's proposals. So there were amendments to the Swedish Penal Code, and particularly in relation to what's called as the Nordic model, to make possible a more nuanced assessment of the penal value in serious cases of purchase of sexual services. And here are some of the countries that have adopted a Nordic-like legislation: Iceland, Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands, South Korea, Israel, more recently France, Ireland. United Kingdom is currently reviewing a reject to decriminalisation or a licensing system on the basis that it would not reduce overall demand prostitution. And the review concluded that Swedish model was superior legislation because it sent an appropriate message about paying for sex, but conceded that it was not practical. So unfortunately, it did not get up. Bulgaria and Bill C-36 in Canada passed in 2015. The bill states that the Parliament of Canada has grave concerns about the exploitation that is inherent in prostitution and the risk of violence proposed to those who engage in it, and recognises social harm caused by the objectification of the human body and the commodification of sexual activity. So lawmakers and policymakers are going this way globally. So we need a fit for purpose legislation in Australia. We know that legalization of prostitution is a foul policy practice. And unfortunately in Australia we have a situation where prostitution laws are inconsistent in each jurisdiction, so it is actually easier to hide victims of trafficking and slavery in brothels when they are domestically trafficked across Australian borders. So our legislation needs to move towards a more victim-centred approach, including providing exit programs, and the human rights community must consider the voices of survivors and see men as a solution to this problem of trafficking and slavery for the purpose of sexual servitude, because their voice is so much stronger amongst their peers, and they need to stand up and talk to their peers about these statistics. So unfortunately, not everyone's on board with these proposals. So Amnesty International has gone the opposite way. They've developed and endorsed a policy approach to prostitution that is incompatible with international human rights legal standards. And this is shameful for Amnesty International, and they should be, and they have been condemned by UN Women as well as others. So Fighting for Justice Foundation is an advocate of the Nordic model because they seek to prevent human trafficking by curbing its demand. And this can only be done by addressing gender-based violence through social and legislative reform in our region. So we run advocacy, education, outreach projects for these purposes. Please go to our website to understand the lobbying, advocacy, education campaigns and outreach events that we run. We encourage a men-led campaign in Australia, and we're excited about ending the demand through education. We provide legal training and education that prevents gender-based violence. And we want you to be aware of the statistics. We want you to ask the questions. We want you to be aware of who might be a victim and to report the crime, and understand what outreach services there are to assist the victims. Thank you.